He lived alone for years, until 5 stunning Apaches arrived asking for shelter. One stayed for love. James had been living alone for years. Ranch was located far from the nearest town, nestled in a wide valley surrounded by rough mountains. His life had changed drastically after the death of his wife. It had been a quiet and lonely existence ever since. He spent most of his time tending to the cattle, fixing fences and taking care of the land. The only sounds around him were the wind, the calls of distant birds, and the occasional rumble of thunder from a storm in the distance. For the most part, James didn't mind the solitude. He had grown used to it. He wasn't one for much company anyway. People around here had their own lives, and James was content to keep to his own. The ranch had been a gift from his father, and he had spent the years after his wife's passing maintaining it. It was a simple life, but one he could handle. He had no real reason to seek the company of others. Still, in the back of his mind, a part of him missed the sound of laughter, the warmth of another presence. On the day everything changed, James had just finished repairing a section of the fence when he saw a group of figures in the distance, moving steadily toward his ranch. At first he thought they might be a group of travelers or perhaps some of the local settlers passing through. But as they drew closer, he saw that there were 5 women, 3 of them on horseback and 2 walking behind.
They were traveling in a line, moving deliberately, and the weathered look on their faces told him they had been through a long journey. It wasn't unusual to see travelers in this part of the country, but something about these women struck him as different.
They were dressed in long, simple skirts and shawls, their faces weathered by the harsh sun, but it was their eyes that caught his attention. Their expression seemed guarded, as if they were carrying something heavy, something they couldn't share. James's first instinct was to turn them away. His ranch wasn't much of a refuge for strangers, and he didn't have the room for guests. But then he noticed the storm clouds gathering in the sky. The wind picked up, and the air became thick with the promise of rain. These women would not survive out here in such weather, not without shelter. Reluctantly, James decided to offer them a place inside. He didn't like the idea of letting strangers into his home, but something about them, something unspoken, made him feel like it was the right thing to do. When they arrived at the ranch, the leader of the group, a woman with long black hair and dark eyes, approached him first. "Thank you for your kindness," she said in a soft voice, her accent thick but understandable. "We've been traveling for days and we need shelter for the night." James nodded, his own discomfort evident in the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other.
"I don't have much to offer," he said, "but you're welcome to stay until the storm passes." The women didn't speak much after that, only exchanging a few words among themselves in their native tongue.
James, who had heard of the Apaches but didn't know much about them, felt an odd tension in the air. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to these women than they were letting on. He had heard rumors about Apache tribes in the area, but he knew better than to believe everything he heard. It was best not to get involved, best to keep to himself. But the storm was coming, and shelter was shelter. Inside the cabin, James offered them blankets and the warmth of a fire. He wasn't much of a cook, but he had some stew simmering on the stove. The women accepted gratefully, though they didn't say much. It was clear they were wary, but their gratitude was real. They ate quietly, their eyes constantly flickering toward the door, as if expecting something. Or someone. James sat in the corner of the room, watching them, unsure of what to do next. He had never been good at small talk, and the silence between them was uncomfortable. Finally, the woman who had spoken to him earlier, the leader of the group, looked up at him and spoke. "Where are you from, rancher?" She asked. "James," he replied. "I've lived here for a long time. Grew up on this land." The woman nodded, her gaze shifting toward the others.
"I am Aya," she said, "and these are my sisters, Yana, Lila, Soraya, and Zuni."
We are travelers. Our camp was destroyed by a raid.
James raised an eyebrow. Raid?
Yes.
Aya replied, her voice distant, almost as if reliving the memory.
We had to flee, but we couldn't carry everything with us. James didn't ask any more questions. He had heard rumors about raids between tribes, but it was none of his business.
He didn't want to pry into their lives. The less he knew, the better. Still, something about Aya's words lingered in his mind. There was pain in her voice, something hidden behind those dark eyes of hers. The storm outside raged on through the night. The wind howled and the rain came down in sheets, battering the cabin's roof and walls.
Inside, it was warm, and the fire crackled merrily in the hearth. But James could feel the weight of their presence.
He could feel the tension in the room, the unspoken things that hung in the air between them. Aya and her sisters seemed lost in their thoughts, their silence only adding to the unease that James felt. He tried to ignore it. He tried to focus on the fire, on the sound of the rain. But something kept drawing his eyes back to Aya.
There was something about her, something he couldn't quite place.
It wasn't just her beauty, though that was undeniable, but something deeper. Something in the way she held herself, something in the way her gaze met his when their eyes accidentally locked. But he quickly looked away, uncomfortable with the sudden rush of emotions that stirred inside him. He was not a man to entertain feelings, especially for a woman from a different world, a different life. She was Apache, and he was a rancher. Two worlds that could never truly meet.
Yet, as the night wore on and the storm continued to rage outside, James couldn't help but wonder what tomorrow would bring.
Would they leave when the weather cleared? Or would they stay longer? Would their presence change his life? Or would they simply pass through, like so many others before them? Desperate. As James lay in bed that night, listening to the storm, he found his thoughts turning back to Aya. He had always been alone, but now, with these women in his home, the silence felt different. It felt more like something was stirring, something he couldn't ignore.
The days following the storm passed quietly, but there was an undeniable tension that seemed to hang in the air.
Bust, to make the women feel at home, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about their presence. He had offered them shelter, but now he found himself questioning whether he had made the right decision. They were kind enough and they helped around the ranch when they could, but something in their eyes told James that they weren't just ordinary travelers. They were carrying burdens, secrets perhaps, and he wasn't sure if they would ever truly open up to him. Aya, the leader of the group, was the only one who spoke to him most of the time. She was always polite, always respectful, but she didn't seem eager to share anything personal. The others, Yana, Lila, Soraya, and Zuni, were mostly quiet, each seeming lost in her own thoughts. They would nod politely when James greeted them, but they rarely initiated conversation. It wasn't that they were unfriendly, but there was an invisible barrier between them and James, something unspoken that kept them apart. Despite the quietness, James couldn't help but notice Aya more and more. She was beautiful. That much was clear. Her long, dark hair framed her face, and her dark eyes held a depth that he couldn't quite understand. She was different from the women James had known in the past. Psst. Psst. She wasn't like the girls from town who were quick to smile and flirt. Aya had a quiet strength about her, a calmness that made James both curious and uneasy. But what unsettled him the most was the way she seemed to carry herself, almost like she was from another world. It was as if she didn't belong here, and yet, in some strange way, she did. One afternoon, as James was working on the barn, Aya approached him. The others had gone into the nearby woods to gather firewood, leaving the two of them alone. The sun was high in the sky, and the dry heat of the day was just beginning to set in. "James," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Can I help you with something?" James wiped the sweat from his brow, trying to ignore the strange feeling that came over him when she spoke.
"I could use a hand with the roof," he said, pointing to a section of the barn that needed repair.
"Psst. It's starting to cave in a bit. If you're strong enough, we can get it done faster." Aya smiled, a small but genuine smile that made James' heart skip a beat. "I'm strong enough," she said simply, and with that she climbed up the ladder to join him on the roof. The two of them worked in silence for a while, repairing the damaged wood and securing the shingles. James found himself glancing at her more often than he cared to admit. There was something about the way she moved, the way her hands worked with such precision, that made him feel an odd sense of admiration. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, and he couldn't help but be drawn to her. As they worked, James tried to keep the conversation light, asking simple questions about her life. "How long have you been traveling?" he asked, his voice casual but filled with curiosity. Aya paused for a moment as if choosing her words carefully. "We've been on the road for many weeks," she said quietly. "Our tribe was attacked. We had to flee, leaving behind everything we knew." James nodded, not sure what to say. He had heard about raids between different tribes, but he had never known the full story. He could see the sadness in her eyes as she spoke, and it made him feel uncomfortable, like he was intruding on something personal. "I'm sorry," he said after a moment. "That must have been difficult." Aya looked at him then, her dark eyes meeting his. For the briefest moment, James felt like she was looking straight through him. There was something in her gaze that made his chest tighten. Something that spoke of loss, fear, and strength, all at once. "It was," she said softly, "but we survived. And now we must keep going."
James didn't know what to say to that.
He had his own struggles, of course, but nothing like what Aya had experienced. His life had been filled with loss, too, but it was a different kind of loss, one that didn't come with the weight of an entire people's suffering. So instead of speaking, he simply nodded, unsure of how to comfort her. He had never been good with words, especially not when it came to matters of the heart, and yet he felt a strange connection to her, something that went beyond their brief conversation. As the afternoon wore on, they finished repairing the roof, and Aya climbed down the ladder with ease. She dusted off her hands and turned to James, her expression unreadable. "Thank you for the help," she said, her voice still soft but filled with a quiet strength. "I'm glad we could finish this." James nodded, still feeling the strange unease that had settled over him. "Any time," he said, though his voice lacked the conviction he wanted it to have. He could feel his heart racing, and he didn't know why. Aya didn't linger. She turned and walked back toward the house, her movements graceful and purposeful. James watched her go, his mind racing with questions he didn't know how to answer. Why did he feel this way? Why was he so drawn to her? But later that evening, as they all sat down to a simple meal of stew and bread, James couldn't help but notice the way the women interacted with each other. There was a quiet bond between them, something unspoken that tied them together. Aya seemed to be the leader of the group, her calm demeanor keeping the others in check. Yana, Lila, Soraya, and Zuni all listened to her, their expressions respectful but distant.
As they ate, James tried to make conversation, but it was clear that the women weren't interested in talking much. Aya occasionally answered his questions, but it was always brief, her gaze flickering toward the door, as if she were waiting for something.
The rest of the women, though polite, remained mostly silent, lost in their own thoughts. James couldn't help but feel like an outsider. I hid. He had invited them into his home, offered them shelter, and yet they were still a mystery to him. He didn't know if they would stay for a few days or a few weeks, but he couldn't deny the growing feeling that something was about to change. Duh. Something deep inside him was stirring, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. As the evening came to a close and the women retired to their corner of the cabin, James lay awake in his bed, staring up at the ceiling. The events of the day played over and over in his mind. Aya's smile, her strength, her quiet strength. He couldn't get her out of his mind, but there was still so much he didn't know. What were they really running from? What did Aya want from him? And why did he feel like his life was on the edge of something he couldn't control? He closed his eyes, trying to silence the questions, but they lingered in his mind, unanswered. And as he drifted off to sleep, he couldn't help but wonder what the next day would bring. The following days passed, and the weather began to change. The storm had cleared, leaving behind a refreshing coolness in the air. It was the kind of crisp, clear morning that James loved. The sun was rising over the mountains, casting long shadows across the land. He could hear the sounds of birds waking up, their calls echoing through the valley. Aya and the others had settled into a rhythm in the cabin. They helped with the chores, gathering firewood, mending fences, and even offering their assistance when the cattle needed tending. James, though still unsure of what to make of their presence, appreciated the help. It made the work go faster, and though they were often quiet, the women's presence was comforting in a way. There was a certain calm about them, something that brought peace to the otherwise silent ranch. But as the days passed, James began to notice that Aya seemed more restless than the others. While the other women appeared content to stay and work, Aya often gazed out at the horizon as though she were searching for something or someone far beyond the ranch. It was a look that didn't escape James's attention. He saw it in the way her shoulders would tense when she glanced toward the distant hills, or in the quiet moments when she seemed lost in thought.
One morning after breakfast, Aya approached James while he was working near the barn
desk. Her expression was serious, more so than he had ever seen it before. He looked up from his work, wiping his hands on his trousers, and greeted her with a simple nod. "James," Aya said softly, her voice carrying the weight of something unspoken. "We must leave soon." James paused, his heart skipping a beat at her words. Breathless. "Leave?" he repeated, his voice thick with surprise. "But why?" "I thought you all were staying until the weather settled." Aya nodded, but her eyes were distant, as though she were seeing something far beyond the ranch. "The storm is over, and we've rested. We have to keep moving. There are others who need our help."
Our journey is far from finished. James's chest tightened as he listened to her words.
He had known, deep down, that this day would come. The women weren't here to stay. They were passing through, just as he had suspected. But there was something about Aya's words, something in her eyes, that made him feel a deep sense of loss. "You don't have to leave," James said, his voice rough with emotion. "I can't offer you much, but you're welcome to stay as long as you need. You don't have to go anywhere." Aya looked at him then, really looked at him. And for the first time, James saw a flicker of something soft in her eyes. It was like a window had opened, and he was catching a glimpse of a world he had never known. But that softness was quickly replaced by the same guarded look she had worn since the moment she had arrived. "I appreciate your kindness," she said quietly, "but I cannot stay. My people need me." James felt his heart sink. He had known this moment would come, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. Aya had her own life, her own responsibilities. She couldn't stay here with him. Not forever. It wasn't right, and it wasn't fair to her. "I understand," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'll miss you, Aya." Aya's eyes softened, and she reached out, placing a hand on his arm. Her touch was gentle, and for a brief moment James felt a warmth spread through him. as if she was trying to ease the ache he felt in his chest. "I will miss you too, James," she said, her voice low and sincere. "But this is not my place. I have a duty to my people." James nodded, though his throat felt tight. He wanted to say more, to tell her that he didn't want her to leave, that he wished she could stay, but the words wouldn't come. He wasn't good at expressing what he felt, especially not now when everything was so uncertain. Later that day, the other women gathered their belongings. They had all made their decision, and though James didn't say it aloud, he could tell that they were ready to go. There was no need for more words. It was understood that they would leave, and they would leave soon.
Aya, however, lingered for a while longer, helping James with some last-minute chores.
But two of them worked side by side. Though the air between them was heavy with the unspoken words, neither one of them seemed able to say. The others had already packed, and it was clear that they were preparing to depart. "Are you sure you don't want to stay?" James asked one final time as they worked together. I could use your help here. There's always more work to do."
Aya smiled, though it was a sad smile, and shook her head. "I can't stay, James."
"But thank you, truly. You've shown us kindness when we needed it most." As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the valley, Aya turned to him once more. She gave him a long, searching look, her eyes reflecting the fading light of the day. "Maybe our paths will cross again someday," she said softly, her voice carrying a note of hope that James wasn't sure he could believe. "I hope so," James replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I truly do." With that, the group of women mounted their horses, and James stood in silence, watching them as they rode off into the distance. His heart felt heavy in his chest, a weight he wasn't sure how to shake. The quiet of the ranch was deafening without their presence, and he felt the loneliness creeping back in, just as it had been before they had arrived. But as the women disappeared over the hill, James knew that things would never be the same. They had come into his life like a storm, unexpected, wild, and full of energy, and now they were gone, leaving behind only memories of their time together.
Aya had been right to leave.
She had a life to return to, a duty she could not abandon. But for James, the void they left behind felt like something he couldn't fill. He had become accustomed to the solitude, yes, but now that they were gone, it seemed as though the emptiness was more profound than before. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, James sat down on the porch, staring out at the land that had once felt like his world. Now it felt as though he was a stranger to it, and the silence around him seemed more oppressive than ever. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. The brief time he had spent with Aya and her sisters had changed him. They had given him something he hadn't realized he had been missing. The feeling of connection, the understanding that sometimes even the loneliest hearts could find a place to belong. James stood at the edge of his porch, watching as the last of the women disappeared over the horizon, their figures growing smaller with every passing moment. A sense of emptiness settled over him, deeper than the quiet that had once defined his life. The loneliness he had grown so used to now felt like a heavy weight on his chest. He had never expected their departure to hit him so hard. It wasn't just Aya he missed. It was the presence of something more, something alive, something he hadn't realized he longed for.
As the days turned into weeks, James threw himself back into the work on the ranch.
There was always something to be done, repairing fences, tending to the cattle, fixing up the barn, but the hours felt longer now, the work harder. And with every task his mind wandered back to Aya.
He couldn't help but wonder how she was doing. Was she safe?
Was she happy? And if she wasn't, would she ever return? These questions swirled in his mind, never giving him peace.
But one morning, weeks after the women had left, James heard something he hadn't expected.
The sound of horses approaching.
He froze, his heart skipping a beat. He had become so accustomed to the silence that even the slightest noise made his senses go on alert. He rushed to the porch, half expecting to see the women returning, but instead he saw only one rider, Aya. Her horse was tired, its mane tangled and matted, and her clothes were worn from travel. She was alone. James's breath caught in his throat as he rushed down the steps to meet her. "Aya!" he called out, his voice filled with both relief and disbelief. "What happened?" I thought. Aya dismounted with a grace that belied her exhaustion. She gave him a tired smile, but there was something in her eyes that James couldn't ignore, something that spoke of struggle, of hardship. "I couldn't stay away," Aya said softly, her voice hoarse from the journey. "I tried, but the path I'm on, it's not the one I want anymore."
James stood there, stunned.
He didn't know what to say. The words stuck in his throat, the realization that she had returned, settling slowly in his mind. "Aya," he began, stepping forward, unsure of what to do next. "What's happened? Why are you alone?" Aya took a deep breath. Her eyes filled with an emotion James couldn't read. "There was fighting," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My people, we had to leave." "Bus." "I couldn't stay. Not when so much was lost. I knew that I had to come back to you." James reached out, his hand hovering just a moment before he placed it gently on her arm. "You're safe now," he said, his voice reassuring, though his own heart was racing.
You don't have to explain it all right now. I'm inside.
"You need rest." Without another word, James helped her into the house. The cabin, which had felt so empty after her departure, now felt full again, though the silence between them was heavy with unspoken words. Over the next few days, Aya recovered, though her mind seemed far away. She spoke little of the journey, of the hardships she had faced. But James could see it in her eyes. The weariness, the sorrow, the weight of everything she had endured. It was clear that her return wasn't just about finding shelter. It was about something deeper, something more personal.
As they spent more time together, James couldn't help but notice the changes in Aya.
She had always been strong, her quiet strength a constant in the time they had spent together before. But now, that strength seemed tempered by pain. She had seen too much, lost too much, and it reflected in her every movement. She no longer spoke of her tribe or of returning to them, but it was evident that a part of her was still tied to that life. James knew she was struggling, though she refused to speak of it. There were moments when he saw her staring out at the land, as if searching for something just beyond the horizon. He wanted to ask her about it, to find out what was on her mind, but he didn't push her. He knew better than to force someone to speak of their pain before they were ready. One evening, after a long day of work, James found himself sitting by the fire, his thoughts drifting to the past, to the life he had lived before Aya came into it. He had never imagined he would find himself here, tending to the land with a woman by his side, a woman who had a life of her own, a life that was so different from his. He had always been a man of few words, content in his quiet existence. But now, with Aya here, things felt different. There was a quiet tension between them, a sense that they were both figuring out how to live in this new reality together. Aya sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea. She had grown quieter in the last few days, and James wondered if the weight of her past was finally catching up with her. He couldn't understand everything she had gone through, but he could see the toll it had taken. "Aya," he said carefully, breaking the silence. You don't have to stay here if it's too much. I'm not asking you to make a life here if it's not what you want. But if you do,
You don't have to carry this alone.
Aya looked at him, her gaze softening as she studied his face.
For a long moment she said nothing, just letting the fire crackle between them. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. I don't know what I want anymore, she admitted, her eyes searching the flames. I came back here because I felt like I had no place left.
But I don't belong in your world, James. DH.
And you don't belong in mine. James felt a pang in his chest at her words, but he didn't look away.
Bosk. You belong here, Aya, he said simply. You don't have to be anything else but yourself. And neither do I. Aya didn't respond right away, but after a long pause she gave a small nod. I know, she said softly. I know. The days that followed were filled with a quiet understanding. Neither of them spoke of the future, of what would happen next. There were no grand plans, no promises of a life together. But in the way they shared the space, the way they worked side by side on the ranch, there was something unspoken, a mutual recognition that they were both at a crossroads, unsure of what lay ahead but willing to face it together, no matter how difficult it might be. James had never expected this. He had never expected to be tied to someone so deeply, someone whose life was so different from his own. But there was something in Aya, something that called to him in a way that he couldn't explain. It wasn't just her beauty, though that was undeniable. It was the quiet strength she carried, the way she had survived and continued on, even when everything seemed lost. And as the days passed, James found himself more and more willing to fight for whatever future they might have. He didn't know what it would look like, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was no longer living in the shadows of his past. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he had a reason to hope. The days on the ranch had begun to feel more like home for James and Aya. The quiet solitude that had once filled James's life now seemed to have taken on a new rhythm. They worked together in the mornings, tending to the cattle and repairing the fences. In the evenings they sat by the fire, often in silence, but there was a sense of comfort between them now, an understanding that didn't need words, breath. Still, as the weeks passed, there was a quiet tension hanging over them. Neither of them spoke much about the future, and both of them seemed to be waiting for something, though neither knew exactly what that something was. Aya had become more and more a part of James's world, yet there was still a part of her that remained distant, like a door that was partially open but never fully unlocked. She had been through so much, and James knew that the past she carried with her wasn't something she could easily leave behind. He could see it in the way she sometimes stared out at the land, her thoughts miles away, as if she were still searching for something she couldn't quite reach. James, too, had his own doubts. He had never been one to express his emotions, not even to his late wife, and now he found himself uncertain of how to navigate the growing connection he felt toward Aya. There were moments when he wanted to tell her how he felt, to tell her that he cared for her in ways he had never cared for anyone else. But the words always stuck in his throat. He was afraid that if he said too much, it would change everything between them. He wasn't sure if she was ready for that kind of commitment, and he didn't want to scare her away. He didn't know how much more of her past she was willing to share, or if she would ever truly be able to let go of the life she had left behind. One afternoon, as they were working together to gather firewood, a group of men arrived on horseback, kicking up dust as they rode down the path. James froze, his heart skipping a beat. The men weren't familiar to him, and he didn't recognize any of them. They were dressed in rough, worn clothing, and their faces were hard, their eyes full of suspicion. They came to a halt in front of the cabin, and one of them, a man with a thick beard, dismounted first. "Afternoon," the man said gruffly, tipping his hat. "We've come to speak with you." James looked at them cautiously. "What's this about?" "We've heard some talk around town," the man said, his tone growing colder. "Heard you've been sheltering an Apache woman here?" Aya, who had been standing nearby, stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the men. James could see the way her body tensed, as if she were preparing for something, though he wasn't sure what. There was a moment of silence, the air thick with unspoken tension, before Aya spoke.
I had no quarrel with you,
She said, her voice steady.
I am here only for shelter.
I've done no wrong, the man scoffed, glancing at his companions. Your people have caused enough trouble around here, he said, his voice filled with contempt. We don't take kindly to your kind, and we won't stand for it. James stepped forward, standing between Aya and the group of men, his heart pounding in his chest. That's enough, he said, his voice firm but calm. Aya is under my protection. She's done no harm to anyone here. If you have a problem with her being here, you'll have to take it up with me. The man glared at him, his eyes full of anger. You're making a mistake, rancher. Brett, she's nothing but trouble. James held his ground, his jaw set. I don't care what you think of her, he said, his voice low and unwavering. Dask, she's staying here, and I'll defend her if I have to. There was a long pause, and for a moment it seemed like the situation might escalate. But then, after what felt like an eternity, the man seemed to relax, his shoulders slumping as if he had made a decision. Breath. Fine, he said gruffly, but don't say we didn't warn you. He motioned to his companions, and one by one they mounted their horses and began to ride off. James watched them leave, his body still tense. He could feel Aya's presence behind him, and when he turned to face her, he saw the relief in her eyes. She stepped forward, her expression softer than it had been in days. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice filled with gratitude. I didn't know what they would do. James nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The situation had been tense, but it was over now. For the time being, at least. He didn't know if those men would come back, but he wasn't about to let anyone threaten Aya. Not after everything they had been through together. I won't let anyone hurt you, James said, his voice softer now. Breath. You don't have to worry about that. Aya looked at him for a moment, her dark eyes searching his face as if weighing his words. Then, without a word, she stepped closer and placed a hand on his arm. The touch was small, but it spoke volumes. I believe you, she said simply. Later that night, as they sat by the fire, James felt a quiet shift in the air between them. It wasn't just the tension of the afternoon that had passed. It was something deeper, great. The connection between them had grown stronger, more certain. The silence between them felt different now. Not uncomfortable, but comfortable. Like two people who had found a quiet understanding of each other. James looked at Aya, his thoughts clearer now than they had ever been. He didn't have all the answers, and he didn't know what the future would hold. But one thing was certain, he didn't want to face it without her. She had come back to him, and though he still didn't fully understand why, he knew that it didn't matter. What mattered was that they were here, together, and that they would figure it out as they went along. Aya, James said, his voice soft. I don't know what comes next. I don't know what the future holds. But I want you to know I care about you. More than I thought possible. Aya met his gaze, her eyes full of something that made James's heart race. It was a look of quiet understanding, of a bond that was being formed in the silence they shared. She didn't say anything at first, but then she gave him a small, genuine smile. I care about you too, James, she said softly. I didn't know what I was searching for when I left, but I think I found it now. And in that moment, sitting there by the fire, James knew that no matter what challenges they would face in the days to come, they would face them together,
The love they had found, fragile and quiet as it was, would endure.
It wasn't a love built on grand gestures or promises.
It was a love built on quiet understanding, on shared strength, and on the willingness to face an uncertain future side by side. As the fire crackled, James felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The world outside was wild and uncertain, but in this moment he was exactly where he needed to be, and for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful.